The police station was quiet until a little girl burst in, shouting, "Please, arrest my daddy." What happened next shocked everyone to the core and left them in tears. Stay until the end to uncover the heartbreaking truth. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe for more gripping stories. Let's begin. The Riverside Police Station was the last place anyone expected a crisis that morning. The slow fans did little to cool the hot summer air as officers drank coffee and skimmed reports. Then, the doors slammed open. A small girl, barely 6 years old, stumbled inside, her tiny chest heaving as if she had been running for miles. Her wide, tear-soaked eyes darted around the room, desperate, searching. Then, in a voice that cracked through the station like a lightning bolt, she cried out, "Please arrest my daddy." For a second, no one moved. Some officers exchanged startled glances, others set their coffee cups down, a few pushed their reports aside. Sergeant Mason, a man who had seen just about everything in his years on the force, leaned forward, studying the little girl with a deepening frown. No child runs into a police station saying something like that for no reason. Officer Rachel, the youngest on the team but known for her sharp instincts, was the first to move. She crouched beside the girl, her voice calm but urgent. "Sweetheart, what's your name?" The girl hiccuped a sob, her small fingers gripping the front desk like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "Lena," she whispered. Rachel softened. "Lena, you're safe here. What happened? Why do you want us to arrest your father?" Lena's little hands curled tighter, her lip trembled, and then she spoke words that sent a chill through the room. "He can't stay free. Please, please take him to jail." The air thickened with tension. Mason pushed back his chair, rising slowly. Every officer in the room knew the weight of a statement like that. Rachel's voice was gentle, but her eyes were sharp. "Did your father hurt you?" Lena hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "He gets angry sometimes." The room went cold. Sergeant Mason's jaw tightened. His instincts screamed danger. Rachel glanced at him, the unspoken question clear, "What are we dealing with here?" Then, before anyone could say a word, Lena spoke again. Her voice was quieter this time. "Mommy went for a walk and never came back." Rachel's breath hitched. Mason's brow furrowed. The officers who had started standing now froze mid-motion. Lena's words weren't just strange, they were unsettling. Mason knelt down beside her, his voice careful. "Sweetheart, when did your mommy go for a walk?" Lena sniffled. "A long time ago." Rachel and Mason exchanged a look. There was no good answer to that. Either the mother had abandoned the child, or something far worse had happened. Mason straightened up, his voice firm. "Get a team to the house now." The station erupted into motion. Officers reached for their radios. Chairs scraped. Voices crackled through the air with urgency. Rachel turned back to Lena, gently pushing a strand of hair from her tear-streaked face. "You're very brave, sweetheart. We're going to help you." But Lena wasn't looking at Rachel anymore. She was staring past her, at something, someone. Only she could see. The squad car pulled up in front of the house. The place was barely standing. Warped wood, sheets instead of curtains, weeds swallowing the yard. Sergeant Mason knocked hard. "Police, open the door." No answer. Rachel listened carefully. No footsteps, no voices, just stillness. Mason knocked again, sharper. "We know someone's inside. Open up." Nothing. Mason's patience snapped. "Take it down." A heavy kick sent the door swinging open. The smell hit them first. Stale air, sweat, something rotten. Inside, the room was nearly bare. A couch, a table, an unplugged TV. And in the corner, a man. Thin. Pale. Barely holding himself up on the edge of a stained mattress. He didn't flinch. Didn't move. Just stared. Mason stepped forward. "Stand up. Hands where we can see them." The man's eyes flickered in confusion. His hand shook slightly. Rachel tensed. Something was off. Mason didn't wait. He grabbed the man's wrist and hauled him up. He nearly collapsed. Rachel's breath hitched. "He can't even stand." Mason locked the cuffs around his wrists. "You're under arrest. You have the right to remain silent." The man finally spoke. His voice cracked, weak. "Why? What's happening?" Mason stayed firm. "We'll talk at the station." The man's breathing quickened. He struggled weakly against the cuffs. Then his voice broke completely. "Wait, no. I have a kid at home." Rachel's stomach dropped. Mason didn't waver. "Your kid's safe. The man's entire body stiffened. His eyes, hollow, panicked, locked onto Mason. "Please," he croaked. "Please don't take me away." Rachel felt it in her gut. Something wasn't right. Mason grabbed his radio. "Suspect in custody. We're heading back now." Rachel stole one last look at the crumbling house. The fridge door hung open. Nothing inside. And for the first time since Lena walked into the station, Rachel wasn't sure they were arresting the right person. Why was he so afraid of being separated from his child? The police car rolled into the station, the tires grinding against the pavement. The man in the back seat sat motionless, wrists bound, head down, his breathing shallow. Not once had he asked why he was being arrested. Not once had he denied anything. Except for one thing. "I have a kid at home." Rachel couldn't shake it. His words weren't defensive, weren't desperate for himself. They were panicked for his child. As the officers pulled him from the car, he barely resisted. His thin arms hung at his sides, the cuffs loose around his wrists. Rachel led the way inside, but something made her hesitate at the station doors. She didn't know why, but the moment they walked inside, she knew everything was about to change. The second they stepped in, a scream cut through the air. "Daddy." Rachel turned just in time to see Lena bolt across the room. Before anyone could stop her, she threw herself into his arms. The man, this weak, exhausted shell of a person, fell to his knees with the force of her hug. His hands clenched behind his back, but he didn't care. His head buried into her shoulder. Rachel stood frozen. The entire station, which had been tense with suspicion, went dead silent. Lena's tiny voice cracked with sobs. "Daddy, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Rachel felt something shift in the air. She looked at Mason. Mason looked at her, and without saying a word, they both knew. They had made a mistake. The station stood still. Officers who had been flipping through reports froze mid-page. Some had barely glanced up when the man was brought in, but now they couldn't look away, because the little girl who had asked for her father's arrest was now clinging to him like she'd never let go. Rachel's pulse hammered. The man's shoulders shook, his hands still bound behind his back. His face buried in Lena's curls, silent, but the tears running down his face said everything. Sergeant Mason cleared his throat, snapping out of the stunned silence. "Let's get him inside for questioning." Rachel hesitated. For the first time since Lena had walked into the station, her gut told her something was off. They weren't looking at an abuser. They were looking at a broken man. She stepped forward. "Let's take off the cuffs." Mason frowned. "We still need to." "He's not a threat," Rachel interrupted, her tone firm. Mason hesitated, then nodded sharply. Rachel stepped closer, pulled out the key, and unlocked the cuffs. The second they fell away, Lena grabbed her father's hands, gripping them tight. Rachel crouched to eye level with her. "Sweetheart, do you remember why you wanted us to arrest him?" Lena's bottom lip quivered. She nodded slowly. Rachel glanced at the father. His face was unreadable. "Can you tell me why?" Rachel asked softly. Lena wiped her tears with the back of her hand, took a shaky breath. And then, her voice broke the silence in the room. "I just wanted him to eat." Rachel stilled. Mason's jaw clenched. The officers exchanged glances, unsure if they had heard her right. Rachel leaned in. "Sweetheart, what do you mean?" Lena sniffled and whispered, "I saw on TV that people in jail get food 3 times a day." Rachel felt her breath catch. Lena's voice trembled, but she kept going. "Daddy never eats. He gives me all the food. And last night, I saw him crying in the kitchen." Rachel's throat tightened. Sergeant Mason, who had remained stiffly silent, finally spoke, his voice lower than before. "What do you mean, Lena?" Lena hiccuped a sob, her tiny fingers curling into her father's shirt. He was looking in the fridge, and there was nothing. He banged the door and she stopped, squeezing her eyes shut. "I got scared, so I ran to get help." Rachel turned to the father. His head was low, his shoulders shaking. Finally, he lifted his face, his eyes hollow with exhaustion but filled with something else, shame. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't want her to know." Mason's jaw tightened. His grip on his belt shifted as if he were struggling to process what was unfolding before him. Rachel's breath felt shaky, her mind piecing it all together. They hadn't arrested a violent man. They had arrested a father starving himself to keep his daughter fed. No one spoke. The weight of Lena's words had settled over the station like a heavy fog, thick, and inescapable. Rachel's chest felt tight as she turned to the man. "You haven't been eating." The man let out a slow, unsteady breath. His gaze remained on the floor. "She comes first." His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Sergeant Mason crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "How long has this been going on?" The man's shoulders tensed, but he didn't hesitate. "Months." Rachel's stomach twisted. She looked at Lena, her small hands still gripping her father's shirt like she was afraid he'd disappear. Rachel's voice was softer this time. "What about her mother?" Lena froze. For the first time since entering the station, she looked away from her father. Rachel noticed the way her little fingers tightened, the slight shake in her breath. The man exhaled, his voice strained, yet steady. "She's gone." Mason's brows furrowed. "Gone where?" A long silence. Then the man lifted his eyes, hollow, tired, filled with something that went beyond hunger. "She died." Lena flinched. Her tiny hands clutched his sleeve tighter. Rachel's throat tightened as she whispered, "When?" The man's jaw clenched. "A year ago." Rachel's breath caught. A year. Lena had been waiting a whole year, believing her mother had simply gone for a walk. Mason exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand down his face. "And you never told her?" The man swallowed hard, his voice rough. "How do you tell a child something like that?" Rachel felt her chest ache. She doesn't know. Lena didn't just lose a mother. She had been waiting for her. Rachel crouched beside Lena, gently placing a hand on her back. "Sweetheart, do you know what happened to your mom?" Lena shook her head, but she didn't look up. Her little voice was barely there. "Daddy said she went for a walk." Rachel's eyes flicked to the man, his expression shattered. He had lied to protect her, but all it had done was leave her waiting for someone who was never coming back. Rachel took a slow breath, keeping her voice steady, gentle. "Sweetheart, your mom isn't coming back." Lena's lip quivered. She turned to her father. "Is that true?" The man's shoulders shook, his face twisting with pain. Finally, he nodded. Lena stared at him. The truth settled in her tiny chest, something too big, too painful. Her voice cracked. "Why didn't you tell me?" The man's breath shuddered. He reached for her hand, his fingers trembling. "I didn't want you to hurt, baby." Lena's small shoulders trembled. Then, slowly, she leaned into him, burying her face into his shirt. Rachel blinked away the sting in her eyes. Mason exhaled sharply, then gestured toward the father. "Let's get him something to eat." One of the officers, who had been silent until now, nodded and disappeared down the hall. Rachel stood, watching as Lena climbed onto the bench beside her father, refusing to let go of his hand. For the first time since she had entered the station, she wasn't crying anymore, but Rachel still felt the sting of it in her own eyes. Officers who had been quick to judge now sat in uncomfortable reflection. The weight of what had just unfolded settled over them like a heavy fog. A father who had given everything for his child. A little girl who had carried a painful truth alone. A community that had overlooked them both. Sergeant Mason exhaled, his voice firm but quieter than before. "They won't make it much longer like this." The father, Adam, sat motionless, his head bowed, his hand still wrapped protectively around Lena's. He hadn't touched the food they had given him. Rachel crouched beside them. "Lena, are you hungry?" The little girl hesitated, then gave a small nod. Rachel nudged the sandwich toward her. "It's okay to eat, sweetheart." Lena glanced up at her father, waiting. Adam barely lifted his head, but he gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. Only then did she take a bite. Rachel saw the way his throat moved, as if he were swallowing down something heavier than hunger. Mason adjusted his belt, glancing at the other officers. "We can't just let them leave empty-handed." A few officers nodded. One hesitated before speaking. "That house isn't livable. He doesn't have a job. What happens next?" Then, without hesitation, Mason turned back to Adam. "We need a janitor at the station. The job's yours if you want it." Adam's head snapped up, his weary eyes widening slightly. "What?" His voice cracked. Mason met his gaze. "You need work. We need help. It's that simple." Adam opened his mouth, but no words came. Rachel saw it, the way his hand gripped Lena's just a little tighter, the disbelief in his expression. Lena's gaze flickered between them, hope creeping into her exhausted face. Rachel spoke gently. "Do you want the job?" Adam let out a shaky breath. His fingers tightened around Lena's just for a second. Then, finally, he looked up and said yes. By morning, the story had spread. The entire town now knew about the little girl who had walked into the police station, asking them to arrest her father, not because he was cruel, but because she was trying to save him. And just like that, something shifted. Neighbors who had never paid attention before suddenly cared. People who had passed by their house without a second glance were now lining up with food, supplies, and offers to help. Rachel stood beside Mason as volunteers arrived, carrying groceries, warm meals, and bags of clothes. A woman approached with a hesitant smile. "I run the diner down the street. I'd like to make sure they never go hungry again." Another man stepped forward, rubbing the back of his neck. "I do roofing. That place is barely standing. I'll fix it up." Rachel's chest felt tight, but this time, it wasn't with frustration. This was hope. Adam stood in the doorway, Lena clinging to his side, watching in stunned silence as the town that had once ignored them came to their aid. Mason walked up and clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You start Monday." Adam swallowed hard, his voice thick. "Thank you." Lena beamed for the first time in days. "Daddy, look, we have food now." Adam let out a shaky breath. Then, for the first time in a long time, he smiled. Rachel glanced back at Lena, watching as she laughed over a toy one of the officers had given her. Lena was just 6 years old, yet she reminded an entire town what it means to care. And because of her, a man who had lost everything had a second chance. It's easy to look away from someone else's struggle, to assume they'll figure it out on their own, that it's not our problem. Let's ask ourselves, how many others are out there, just like Adam and Lena, hoping someone will step up before it's too late? What would our communities look like if we all paid just a little more attention? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's start a conversation about kindness and action. If this story moved you, take a moment to help someone today, because sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change everything. And before you go, don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button, and turn on notifications so you never miss an incredible story like this one. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.